Welcome to the Spent the Rent podcast. I am your host, Patty Rose. My guest today talking about housing in Lane County is Thomas Fiorelli. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
We're going to talk about the most pressing issue in Lane County, housing, and that is only getting more serious with this whole shelter-in-place order. Thomas, tell us a little bit about what you do. So you are a PhD student in landscape architecture at the University of Oregon, master's degree in public administration at the University of Oregon, and your background primarily is in land use and public policy. And then right now you are a fellow at the University of Oregon. You can explain that to us.
Yeah, that's correct, Patrick. So my background is originally in planning and public policy. So I started out my academic trajectory as looking at how we build our cities and what we do with the spaces that are around us. And that quickly got me interested in the financial side of things, particularly in housing. I went on to a master's program and looked at particularly public policy and the economics behind that. So what I'm doing right now in landscape architecture is trying to identify places throughout the county right now, but really anywhere in the country where we have these vacant properties that aren't being utilized in an efficient way. And there's lots of things we can do with those properties. The most pressing issue right now that I could think of is housing. And in a lot of ways, we have transitionary housing opportunities for these homes, for these spaces, but also opportunities to build homes. And so those are some of the things I'm looking at right now in my research.
It's cool because we've talked about this. It's funny. A little back history. I've known you for going on 10 to 15 years. I'm not sure if it's 15 or 10.
No, long while.
We've crossed paths, walked by each other, but in today's world, both of us had headphones on, and lately. But I used to cut your hair when when I worked at Don's Barbershop on West 11th years ago.
Yeah.
And then in those days, you were working with Peter DeFazio. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I spent an election cycle working for Peter DeFazio, and I volunteered for him multiple times since.
So you've been very passionate about different, issues about helping. In the intro of the audio of this, I said that your passion is helping the underemployed and the working poor, and you and I have very similar values with that. And so one of the things that's really cool is when we recrossed paths and you came into my new barbershop, you were like, well, I just came in for a haircut and then saw you were working here. This is really cool on campus. We got to talking about what you're doing with housing and whatnot. And the cool thing is that you have a passion for helping people that are struggling financially, but also ways that we can make it to where people aren't forgotten that are actually doing well, the ways that it can benefit everybody. And that's something that really needs to be addressed, because there's this divide right now in the city or in Lane County. It's like working people versus the poor, that they're trying to pit people against each other. 1 year ago, almost to the date, I had Daniel Ivey on the podcast, and we talked about YIMBY, which is Yes in My Backyard. And we're going to get into that a little bit about what that means, just in case people are unfamiliar, because in 1 year, a lot has changed and the podcast has grown. So let's really, first of all, talk about why housing is such a huge issue. One of the things you had mentioned off air is that housing has just become expensive, and so let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So, across the entire West Coast, it's not just Eugene or Lane County or even Oregon that is facing this housing crisis issue in terms of affordability. It's really everywhere from the southern border all the way up through Washington, and a lot of the affordability issue has to do with the fact that we've been so successful in a lot of ways across the West Coast in creating high-tech sectors where there are really great jobs, and we're drawing people from literally all over the world to move to these areas. But then what we end up with is the same sort of supply and demand market issues that we see, where the supply begins to not necessarily decrease, it's just not increasing at the rate that the demand is increasing. And we see a lot of these pressures as a result, leading policymakers at the state level and at different local levels to try to deal with that issue in different ways that are sometimes fractured and not always working in a way where they actually complement one another.
Right. And then that's kind of what I was getting at, where a lot of times people, when they think about the economy, for example, they don't really, you look at factors that are not realistic, like the stock market, you know, because we're seeing right now with, there's what, we don't know the exact number, but it could be as high as 20% of the country is unemployed. And the stock market, the total number is like still at 24,000 or whatever. It's doing well. You know, like that part of it is doing well. So if that's the metric that we go by for the economy, then it's misleading. So like you said, when you have these opportunities for tech growth all up the West Coast, you have all these people coming here that are used to paying, people in San Francisco that move up to Eugene for school, they're used to this exorbitant amount of rent. So the university knows that, and then that's what they charge. And we see places, one of the big ones that sticks out to me is the 35 Club Road property that went up. And I mean, it's frustrating, their tagline, I've talked about it a little bit on the show. Their tagline is when luxury meets location, and it's like, yeah, but we're in a town where we need affordable housing. And then I've looked at the rates on that, and it's like $3,500 for a 2-bedroom apartment, and that's insane. I think y'all might've lost your audio.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there, you're good. You're good. Okay. So that, stuff like that, the city has done some things to require for buildings like that are high end to include some low income housing on it. Is that correct?
That's not always the case. In particular, when we see housing for students, for example, student housing has been pumping out rapidly.
Oh my gosh.
Over the past decade and a half. And that's largely because of the Great Recession, where lots of people lost their jobs and went back to school. And so we saw enrollment rates at both the university level, as well as at the sort of junior college, community college level skyrocket. And schools were doing very well at a time when lots of other industries were not. As a result of that, college towns like the University of Oregon started seeing a rapid increase in student housing. Lots of these housing projects were built by developers who were either from out of the city or even outside the state. One of the things Eugene has in place is something known as the multiple use property tax exemption, where effectively the city will give a 10-year tax break to a developer for building something that has more than one use, more than one single family can live in it. So we're thinking multiple families. Student housing fell under that category, which gave a significant incentive for developers to build student housing. And so what we started to see recently with the improvement in the economy, and I truly hope that it continues that direction, we'll see with everything going on with the coronavirus. But what we've seen now is enrollment rates are dropping at the university level. And the question becomes, what can we do with those student housing units when they're no longer in demand by students? And there's lots of debate.
And the price on those units is so high that a working person in this town is not remotely interested in renting that.
Right. And the other thing is, even if we could bring the price down, that's kind of a mismatch for single families. If somebody has kids, those are really designed for people living in a shared co-living space.
Right. Yeah. Because at 38 years old, I'm not trying to live at 2125 Franklin, where there's a rooftop terrace or or whatever it is. That might be the different property. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely not designed for people like me. This is kind of off the topic, but one of the things we're talking about Lane County. We're not just talking about Eugene. And I know that in Florence, there's a huge issue because people it's a tourist area. Typically right now it's kind of shut down, but the big issue with housing in Florence is that people that are, 20s, early 30s that are service industry people, they can't find housing because there's not enough apartments. So it's like across the county, there's different issues for each group. Now, I also wanted to talk about urban growth boundaries, and urban growth boundaries in Eugene specifically has been a long fight. And explain to us what that is, UGBs, urban growth boundaries.
Sure. So Oregon was the first state in the country to think about ways that we can control development that balances human needs, what we need for cities to develop and grow, balancing that with protecting our environment and trying to make sure that we don't destroy farmland and forest land that's really valuable. And part of the reason Oregon is so beautiful and green today is because of that. And what they did is they effectively passed a law, and these lines are called urban growth boundaries, where they draw a line around cities with over a certain number of population. So any city over 4,000 people has to draw a line around it. And what that line effectively is it's a political boundary, and you shall not build outside of that line. So all of the underground infrastructure, electricity, water, sewer, all of those things that are very expensive to send miles and miles away from the city, it's cheaper if we actually keep that contained within the urban growth boundary. But what that does, though, is it constrains opportunities for people who could afford housing if they could drive until they qualify, which is what we refer to that as, where in a lot of places, most places around the country, you can just move to a bedroom community that basically develops from the ground up enough miles away from the city center where people work to where it becomes affordable, and they simply drive a long distance, sometimes a half an hour to an hour to work every day. But we don't do that in Oregon as much because of these urban growth boundaries.
Right. And I think at one point Springfield was kind of considered that to Eugene, but at this point, Springfield we've done this ad nauseum on the podcast. We've talked about the growth of Springfield and the progress that it's made and the successful leadership. But Springfield, people are like, no, I'm working right here. It's cheaper to run a business. There's just so many different factors, but that's a whole different issue. Yeah, that's, back to what you were speaking about before I moved on, talking about the, what did you call it? You were talking about the student housing and the multi-use tax deduction.
Yeah, the MUPTI.
That's a really interesting thing about, I wonder when the lobbying or whatnot by the developers, I'm not trying to throw them under the bus because they've got a job to do as well. But when they were putting that in, they knew how to, jump through those holes. Cause I don't think or those hoops, I don't think that was the intention of those tax deductions, and it's just, that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, so, that's a debate that's going to go on for some time, and it still does in this city.
Yeah. So, lane counter shelter feasibility study. You had told me a little bit about that. There was a study done about the homelessness, and which is obviously a huge thing. And this is where I had mentioned before about how there's kind of the media or whoever it is locally is trying to pit the business, the working people, business owners and whatnot versus the homeless. And there is issues. Nobody's going to say that the homeless population or houselessness population doesn't have its issues. There's rampant addiction, but then again, not everybody that's homeless is an addict. And there's people that don't want help. And there's people that aren't from our area that come here because of the social services that we offer. Now, tell us a little bit about that study and what it found.
So Lane County, along with the city of Eugene, partnered to commission a feasibility study. So Lane County is a community of care. So under the federal government, any community that organizes effectively any type of homeless services has to produce reports. They have to do point-in-time counts, which is what we just did in this past January. They do that every single January where they count the number of people using a methodology that a lot of folks consider rather flawed to identify the number of people in the area. And this feasibility study wanted to go a layer or several layers deeper than that. They wanted to try to understand what was really at the root of the problem itself. So they wanted to understand what groups of communities really exist in this big nebulous group that we sort of think of as the homeless
yes.
population. So that's one thing they did. And the second thing they did is they took a real big deep dive into how we organize our systems, both ones that are controlled by the local governments and by the county, as well as those that work as nonprofit organizations and provide supplemental services. They wanted to understand how coordinated all of those organizations were at addressing this problem. So what's often, that feasibility study is often referred to as the TAC report, the TAC reports. And that TAC simply references the name of the consulting firm, the private consulting firm that the county and the city hired to complete that feasibility study.
And the feasibility study found that there was as many as 2,100 homeless residents. Is that the correct number?
Yeah, that's correct. The number that they identified actually in the report. Now, they wrote the report in December of 2018, so the only number they had to go on was that static annual count. So we take the count every January. And in the 2018 report, basically they were writing it almost a month before they were going to take the next count. And so they quoted the 1,600 that were counted in the 2019, January 2019 point in time count. The next month following their report, this is before I believe they even presented to the joint bodies, both county and city of Eugene, that number had gone up by over 400 people to over 2,000 total.
Which is a huge percentage, 15 to 20. I'm not a mathematician, but yeah, that's bad. Are you losing me?
No, I can hear you, Pat.
Okay, good. So let's see. Another thing we had kind of talked about with urban growth boundaries is there's a desire to protect, the marshlands and the wild and the wetlands and whatnot. But so green energy is something that's really important to you, I know. It talked to us a little bit about some of the proposals with green infrastructure for developers. So ways that they're talking about solutions, by building, basically by having new properties and multifamily properties. We're going to get to it in a little bit more about, where did I write it? Accessory dwellings, and that's what NIMBYism, that's what they're trying to fight against. And that's what Daniel Ivey was all about with YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard is what YIMBY stands for. And I definitely recommend anybody listening to this to go back and listen to that episode. And also just type in YIMBY. And there's a lot of information. So YIMBY, Lane County, and Daniel Ivey's doing a lot of really great work trying to work towards that. But tell me a little bit before we get to that about green infrastructure in new properties and how that can be done, especially for tiny homes for the homeless, and how that can be green energy.
Yeah. So quickly, green infrastructure refers to any sort of any sort of design implementation that doesn't necessarily involve lots of concrete and lots of taking stormwater and pollutants in our environment and sending them long distances through concrete pipes. Green infrastructure refers to keeping those resources, water, on site, and basically remediating those pollutants that are in that water, oftentimes on really, really damaged sites. So one of the things I was talking to you about is my focus is contaminated properties, places where, maybe there was a former industrial use or something like that. So it's not necessarily new properties that I'm looking at. It's just underutilized and vacant properties that might even look like they've never been used before, but they have in many cases. They have had prior uses, and there's sometimes underground pollutants. So what we can do with green infrastructure is we can design properties where we put in stormwater drainage that goes to a natural sort of wetland looking area where it sits there and slowly goes into the soil where those pollutants are remediated, making the site healthier and safer, not only for the neighborhood in terms of aesthetics, they want their neighborhood to look nice,
Sure.
but it also offers an opportunity to create some temporary housing, some whether it be shelters or whether it be something transitional, or whether it be something even on the permanent supported housing end, like what we typically see with Square One villages. Those are, for all intents and purposes, permanent tiny homes like what we see over on Railroad Avenue here in the city of Eugene.
Mm-hmm. I know. So you said transitional housing, and on Tuesday I'm going to be sitting down with Chris McAllister, and we're going to talk about the Memorial Building in Springfield. They're doing a shelter for the houseless people right now, because with COVID, it's really difficult with social distancing, where you have these areas that the city is allowing people to go. And in Springfield, there's there's no camping rules. You know, you can't camp it, which this is a really difficult issue because as a citizen of Springfield, I like that to an effect, to a point, because I think that, you know, the trash and whatnot, we're not ignoring that fact. A lot of times when people talk about the homeless population in a positive, that they're like, we need to help these people, they ignore some of the downsides and some of the reasons that business owners are frustrated. So this is where city government has to really tackle this two-pronged approach. You have to bridge the gap or bridge the divide, but there's a lot of frustration. I mean, I know that I work at the barbershop on campus, and there's been multiple times when I come through the back door and someone has used it as a toilet, you know, and that is an issue that I always say, it's like, it's really hard to blame the poor. You know, this is a completely different issue, but one of the things that frustrates me with a talking point people will get on completely off base, but people will say, you know, it really makes me mad when I see people buying like steak or expensive food on a food card. And I'm like, that bothers you, but you know, you never complain about missiles, you know, and like, you know, so people's priorities are wrong. And I always kind of compare it to the caste system, like in India, where it's the poor telling the middle class to think that it's the wealthy telling the middle class that it's the poor that's causing the problems. And so it's a huge issue. So what are some of the solutions in housing? There's two things that you had you had told me that we can discuss. And one is to control the price and increase supply. So let's talk about controlling the price. How can local government go about that?
Yeah. So, you know, when we try to put price controls on the housing market, typically what we see is, unless it's a really big city, what we see happening is those sorts of policies coming from the state level. And so the state of Oregon did put in the rent control policy, or it's actually a policy preventing increases, keeping it at a cap every single year. Most renters are very familiar with that particular policy, and it was the first in the nation to do something like that.
Well, that's good. And so rent control is, I mean, you hear about that, you think of New York and places like that, where there's these, you know, places that if it doesn't change hands completely, like I don't know how that all works, but I remember there was an episode of Friends about that. But so increasing supply. So giving developers money, accessory dwellings, and then HB 2001, which is a single family zoning rule. Tell us about HB 2001.
Yeah. So HB 2001 is the state's way of saying it's the first time in the country that any state has passed a law that said single family zoning. We're removing that as a requirement for neighborhood areas in cities. So what we have typically is neighborhoods zoned where you can only build a home that fits one single family, and it has the typical lot that we're all familiar with, and somebody mows that grass every single week, and they're pretty far spaced apart. Nobody's telling developers that they can't build single family housing anymore. What has happened is that the state has gone to the cities and said, you no longer can prevent people from building fourplexes. So what HB 2001 does is it allows a developer or even a homeowner who decides it's time to rip down their home and build something new, instead of putting up another single family home in places like Portland, where we have large urban areas, you can put in a fourplex. In places that are rural, so we're thinking, I was going to say like Albany or Corvallis, but they're growing rather quickly.
Sure.
But rural areas, you can put in duplexes, and then in really far-flung areas that might not even be large enough to have an urban growth boundary, for example, they have no requirement whatsoever, because they're not facing, in a lot of ways, they're not facing the housing affordability issues that our urban areas are.
So these are state laws?
Yeah. So what the state did is they passed this law, and they said that every single city has to change their comprehensive plan and their zoning laws to match House Bill 2001. And that has to be done by June of 2022. So right now, there is a whole group of people, professionals from planning and architecture and policy, who are writing the rules for that policy. When the state writes a policy, they say, this is what we want done and this is our intention, but we're not putting any details into this. We have to move on and write other laws. We're going to have somebody else put together the specific language. And so that's happening right now. Some cities can get on board with a law and write their own zoning laws that are compliant. And for the cities that don't have that capacity, maybe they don't have a full-time planner, or they just have one planner who handles everything in the city. In that case, the state is putting together what we refer to as a model ordinance, or something that a small city could just look to the state for a plug-and-play option.
So, in your opinion, how much of a difference can ADUs make? Accessory dwellings, if people are able to have, what do they call them, like mother-in-law housings or whatever? Like the little extra house behind your house kind of thing. How much of a difference can that kind of stuff make?
Yeah, accessory dwelling units are great. And it's important to note that House Bill 2001 not only had the provision to build these dense buildings like fourplexes and duplexes, but it also included provisions for the accessory dwelling units like what you're talking about. And just to back up, I think most people are familiar with this, but it's worth noting. An accessory dwelling unit is basically what we think of as a tiny home that has a fixed foundation. So you put it in your backyard. Maybe you build an entire village, something similar to Square One Villages here in Lane County. This is different from a tiny home on wheels, or a THO is what we call them. A tiny home on wheels is still, at this point in time, classified as an RV, so that's not falling under House Bill 2001. So getting at your question, though, with ADUs, they can make an impact. So what we're saying is that we're giving homeowners the ability to build these in their backyards. So there's around 40,000 or so single-family zoned properties in the city of Eugene. I can use that for a good example. Not everybody who owns one of those lots is going to want to put in an accessory dwelling unit. For those who do, they're going to do it for a number of different reasons. It might be, you mentioned the mother-in-law suite. They might want to save money and have Aunt Alice live in the backyard.
Sure. Or a college, I have 2 kids, stepsons that are college age. And for them, it's like, if they're at Lane, ideally they would be at home, So if we had a place for them, we have, our lots are subdivided where we live. So behind us is an empty lot that's just, all it is blackberry bushes. And every day we look at blackberries coming through our fence, and we're like, gosh, I want to buy that lot, and obviously in the economic climate of today, with me not working because of the shutdown, that's not even feasible. But down the road, we will get back on our feet as far as it goes, and everybody will prevail past this. That gets me to my next question, and I kind of had referenced it before, and I want to go into it a little bit deeper. The effects of COVID-19, both politically and economically. I want to remind people again, I kind of mentioned it and then I went off track. Chris McAllister, who's running for city council in Springfield, he'll be on the Spend the Rent podcast on Tuesday. And he's doing, like I said, he's got the homeless shelter at the Memorial Building, and then also the fairgrounds has a shelter as well. Is that still going?
As far as I know, yeah.
And this is really good because for homeless people, during this, with social distancing, is very difficult. And we kind of mentioned that before. So the political and economic fallout from this is going to be massive. One of my biggest fears is that politically, local governments, the revenues, because of the taxes that have been lost because people are unemployed, are going to be gone. So that is a big fear of mine, that some of these things that especially in Eugene, where homelessness is, we have some of the highest per capita homelessness in the nation. And I'm worried that local government is going to be decimated to the point that there's not much that they can actually do. So that's another thing with the ADUs, the accessory dwellings, that it sounds like it gives it to the homeowner to where they can then do their part. Is that true? So it's not just the city government that's like, okay, let's only build new properties, that these people can then invest in an accessory dwelling on their property, like individual homeowners.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm really glad that you brought up the government funding piece, because that's very important and closely related to this particular issue. So there's something called system development charges, and this is the fee that you have to pay to connect to sewer and water and have somebody come out and take a look at that and go through the entire code review process at the city level. Now, it's important to note that the city doesn't have a lot of places to get revenue besides their number one is tax revenue, so property taxes. Other places are things like system development charges. The problem is, though, that those system development charges can become extremely expensive, several $1,000s, making it almost impossible, and in many cases, literally impossible for a homeowner to afford to put an accessory dwelling unit on their lot. We see cities like Portland who have reduced and in some cases waived those fees for different groups. The city of Springfield tries to do things like that as well. And the city of Eugene even has a pool of money where nonprofit applicants who are providing housing for people who are really in a needy situation, they're going to build some transitional or even some permanent supported housing on a lot they own or they're going to buy. They can apply for waivers for system development charges as well. The problem is that there's not a lot of money to go around, and the city really needs those funds. And this gets back to policies that we passed in the 1990s, which reduce the amount of property tax revenue that cities can get from property owners. And so what's happened here is we have this housing crisis. We have this really great tool we can use, this accessory dwelling unit tool, but we also have this financial barrier that sort of pits these homeowners who would like to build something against the city, who doesn't really have a lot of other places to get revenue from.
What does the money go towards? Like the fees, so if somebody wants to, like the permit process, or what does the money go to?
So the money goes towards serving the public. It goes into, as far as I'm aware, it goes into our general fund. I don't know that there's any specific line item in the budget where system development charges actually go into and fund a specific policy. And that's the case with lots of different revenue sources that come from taxes and other places, primarily from taxes. Is the city then uses that money as a big pool of money that they then allocate to different line items.
Sure. Right. Yeah. So that's difficult. I know that back during the recession of 2008, and I was cutting hair, I was talking to people. Now, this is a business end of it, not a housing end of it, but it's similar, that people were talking about trying to open a business that would create 2,000, whatever, X amount of jobs in Lane County. And the amount of money that Lane County would want for the permit is astronomical. So the same permit for a warehouse in Detroit, for example, was like, I'm just throwing a random number, but it was like $70, $80. And in Lane County, it's like $3,000 just for the permit to break ground. And so those fees and those kind of things, it's like, well, where is that going? It's a really tough thing, because I believe in social services and I believe in helping people, but you need to make sure that the taxation is actually helping those people. So There has to be checks and balances. There has to be some kind of auditor that's looking into that. I know that that's something that a couple of the candidates of Secretary of State have talked about, is auditing these programs to make sure that the money is actually going to the things that it's designed to help, and not slush funds or making sure that the potholes are fixed on the mayor's drive home. So that's tough. Well, this is awesome, Thomas. I appreciate you doing this and talking to me. Housing is definitely the number one issue. And we had this scheduled, and it was a little bit, altered. We had this scheduled months back, and you had gotten a hold of me, and I'm so glad you did, because I might have forgot, because things are so out of the norm. You were going to do it. You were going to come and be here in person, and hopefully when this thing is all over, then I can have you on again and we can talk a little bit more thoroughly in person. I kind of prefer the face-to-face interviews. For one, the audio quality is a lot more clear. And it's just more personal, you know, and it's something that I kind of miss that interaction. All of us are going a little crazy right now. How are you doing with this? Now you're working, but you're doing it 100% remotely, right? Are you basically just staying at home?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate. I do research at the University of Oregon, and I co-teach at the University of Oregon as well. So all of that is happening on Zoom right now.
Yeah. So Zoom has been really cool, and I'm working out some kinks. New webcam. I'm actually using my iPhone. I was gonna keep that a secret, but so there's some new things. I want to mention one thing. One of my sponsors, J.R. Ewing, in my sponsors page of the website, strpod.com/sponsors. You can click on his little business card on there. And if you're looking to buy a home, so we're talking about housing, he sells houses. He's my best friend from high school. I've known him since we were about 13 years old. And so he's one of my sponsors, and you can check that out. Also, if you'd like to donate to the podcast, you can go to strpod.com/sponsors. And I want to give a special thank you to all the people that have donated money. I'm not going to list names because they know who they are, but their donations have been super gratefully appreciated. That's keeping me going. Sometimes even a small donation to the podcast to me can, you know, it may not be a life-changing amount of money, but the mindset that it puts on me, I can be really kind of struggling because I still have not gotten accepted on the unemployment stuff. And there's no sign of when we're going back to work as a barber. And sometimes even a $10 donation, I get this little alert and it's like, you have received a donation. I'm like, ooh, someone cares, you know, and now there's that care emoji on Facebook too. So that's life-changing. No, but well, Thomas Fiorelli, thanks a lot. And, you know, I definitely want to recommend people look up YIMBY in Lane County. Is there any resources that you really like to utilize that people should know about?
Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend that folks look up the feasibility study that I was referencing earlier, which is called the TAC report. It's really important to understand, you know, a couple of things that they point out. There's up to 1,000 people houseless in Lane County on any given night. That's a big number that it points out. There are 137,000 units that we do not have. That's essentially families who need homes who don't have them across the state of Oregon in total. These are some of the numbers that the TAC report identifies, and it really brings to light not only the issue we're facing, but also maybe recommend some ways that we might be able to get a handle on it now. So check out the TAC report, read it. It's definitely a valuable piece of information to understand.
Is that something that people could just Google, the TAC report?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually. It's on the Lane County website. Let me just grab the exact name of it.
Maybe you should just, how about just when we get done talking here, you can just send me the link and I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that would be really good. Well, you know, Thomas Fiorelli, this is really cool. And I can tell just by looking at you that you definitely need to come see me soon. As soon as we open, you need a haircut.
Yeah, I'm keeping it all under a ton of products. So yeah, I'll definitely see you soon.
I appreciate you not taking drastic measures and start cutting it yourself or doing whatever. And I also appreciate you not messaging me and be like, can I come into your house and you can cut my hair during a shutdown? You know, you're bless their heart, the people that have, but it's really frustrating to me when they have, because they message me and they're like, can I get a haircut at your house? And I'm like, absolutely not. Do you understand that this is a health risk?
So wait, Pat, are you saying that getting my hair cut isn't worth risking my life?
No.
Okay.
And the lives of others. No, I mean, and I understand where people are coming from, and some of it, I'm not going to complain, because some of the people that I've reached out, it was really awesome to talk to them. But there's been a few that I had one person message me and wanting a haircut, and he literally was like, I thought we were homies, bro. And I'm like, oh, really? So me not breaking the law and risking my career, that makes me not your homie? You know, so anyways, we're going to end this. This is a treat. So SelfEsteem BoatWillie is what I used to go by with my music. And now I've transitioned into Patty Rose. But because of the shutdown, a good friend, Cesar Morales, he's a DJ, had posted on Facebook. He's like, anybody interested in having me remix their songs, send me your vocal track. So I sent him one from Don't Look Back, which is probably my most popular song under the name SelfEsteem BoatWillie. It's featuring Josh Martinez. So this is, we're going to end it with a song. This is me, SelfEsteem BoatWillie, remixed by Cesar Morales, featuring Josh Martinez. This is Don't Look Back. Thomas Fiorelli, thanks a lot for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
You can look back. up the pieces, face a place far beneath us. We disgrace the deceit and empty space found between us. You know in your heart there is no going back, but you can't find a start to your battle track path. A machete to the landscape, clear your mental dreamscape. Good is what you're calling her to feel like a victim. You need to stop calling her, the choice is now you picked them. Puff your chest out and push on to the next bout of depression, as the isolation is a safe space, but it leaves you with a pretty sour taste if you wallow in it. She's hollow, only in it for herself. Let her go break the heart of somebody else. And goblins, I feel pressure in the way you chase pleasure. I cannot rap with you, MC Escher. I mean, I measure my manhood and be what I say. I've been bad and I am good, and I mean what I say. I love you and I hate you, and you know this. There were other choices, but bitch, you